Hello, TCAOR members. My name is Chris Jolly. I am the president of the TCAOR this year, 2024. And Michaela Cheney and Melissa Sanchez and I are here on behalf of your education committee. We got together a couple of weeks ago with a pretty good sized group and recorded some conversations. And I'll leave it at that. This endeavor was Michaela's brainchild, and I'll let her tell you about what we had in mind.
Hi, everyone. So, yes, my name is Michaela. We brought this over to you guys just for more education. We thought everyone else is having these side table talks. Why don't we bring this all together as an education team and kind of have the talk for you all to see? So, Melissa also mentioned that we would be graceful and
Yes, we're just asking that everybody would just lead with grace, everybody be kind in the situations that are going on with all the changes that are coming about. Again, just to reiterate, we all sat down and created this video. This is just video one of many. Stay tuned for the next video.
hope this helps.
Alrighty, well, everyone, I'm glad you're here and you're watching. You have been invited and you're basically at our table talk. So today of the Education Committee, we decided that we are going to have our table talk that has been talking about with amongst each other throughout our brokerages, and we decided that we're going to bring everybody here that is obtaining to a team in real estate. So we'll have your escrow officers, your lenders, and your local agents, and your everybody that is. Hold on, I'm sorry. I feel like I'm being transported, but it's really just table talk. So, anyways, sorry. Yeah, we're just gonna get started and jump into those outside conversations and bring them here together. So, go ahead and jump in, Chris.
One of the conversations we were having earlier, and we'll go ahead and revisit it, was I keep hearing people asking about what about loan concessions and what's allowable. And I know that NAR and CAR lobbied to have rules changed. We have a couple lenders with us. We'll ask you guys what's allowable. How does a seller paying compensation through concession to a buyer affect what a seller can contribute on a loan?
So they just came out with new rules pertaining to VA just on August 10th, 2024. And this is as long as it's customary and reasonable for the market, you can pay directly to the agent the commission, and it doesn't count towards the 4% cap on seller concessions at all.
Same goes true with FHA, your conventional. All of that stays the same. The concession is the same as normal. So any type of seller compensation is not going to be included in what's allowed for buyer compensation. So we're still okay in the same, business as usual.
So on a conventional, so let's say a non-owner occupied conventional sale, the allowable seller contribution is 2%. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
And so now it could be 2% plus any commission that they're paying.
Correct.
Now, does the property have to appraise if we stack it? So if we're asking for concessions?
We are still going to go based on appraised value. So that doesn't change at all.
So you can say, let's say it comes in at 300, and then you're asking for 4%, but you're in escrow for 325. It's 300,000, right?
Yeah, we're not including it in the loan.
You're not including in the loan.
We can't.
Okay.
No, everything is based on what our appraised value is.
Correct. Got it.
Talking about that, so we had that appraiser panel earlier this week, and they were asked specifically about this, and I believe George Kreitz responded that they can't report on what they don't know, and so our commission fields have been removed. There is talk from the MLS committee about some seller concession fields that might be added, but for now, it's going to be tough to compare and add value or take value away based on whether they pay commission or not.
Concern as far as appraisal. So with all that being said, that since we're bundling all this up and the concessions are two separate fields, as far as a home appraising now, does anybody have any concerns as far as is it going to make appraisal because the value is this, but yet we have to pad it enough to be this now? And that's an open question to the room.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll tell you one of my experiences is that the appraisers right now seem to be erring on the side of conservatism versus like they were a few years ago. So I honestly feel like we will have a little bit of a challenge right out of the gate.
I don't see that. As far as who's paying the commission, nothing's changing really. In a situation where we would be concerned about that, we're concerned because the seller's got this extra concession, but it was already there before. It just wasn't a concession before. So I don't see it as being an issue. I don't. I just don't.
About appraisals, maybe we're thinking along the lines of to be competitive with our offer, we might need to add to the asking price to account for that extra concession, kind of like we always did sometimes in different markets where we added to the sales price and to allow for the net for the seller to be the same, right? That's where we're going to probably run into challenges, and we just want to make sure that we think it will appraise if that does happen, right?
Just for escrow, I'm talking about the net sheet and the concessions. How will that look for us now?
Of what we've been told, we're gonna show it on two different line items. So if there is like a seller concession for 3% towards closing costs, we'll show that on one line item, and then a separate line item for sellers broker compensation. So it'll kind of break it apart. I mean, I'm sure it'll probably be a case by case basis. If some lenders want to see it all lumped together, we can do that as well. But I think to keep it easy for buyers to understand, like I'm getting this much for concessions towards my closing costs, and then I'm getting this much towards the buyer broker compensation, and they kind of want to see that as a wash. They're seeing the credit come in, and then they're seeing a charge going out, so they can kind of compute that easier when they see that, you know, X dollars amount coming in and X dollars amount going out as the wash, and then they see the concessions showing 3% seller concessions towards closing costs. Keep it easier on both. That's how at least we're thinking it's all gonna happen on Monday the 17th.
Yeah.
But as we know, things can change. Things can change, and you know, just to remind everybody, and I know like Chris had talked about it earlier, everything now has to be in writing. So before it could be like how Chris said, throws an email, you know what, I'm going to lower my commission down to 2.5%. We help the seller out or whatever. Everything has to be in writing to us. We're a neutral party, so we take things in writing instructions. And, you know, when the contracts come in, our main first thing we're going to look at is that page 2 of the 3G3, if that's checked or not checked, and then we're going to ask accordingly. If it's checked, you know, we need to see those forms on what. And like I said, it's going to be a case-by-case situation, so I know every escrow is going to be different, and then we're going to show it on the settlement statement accordingly.
I have a question. Is the court-ordered sales like probate, that's controlled by the court, meaning this is exempt, correct, from this new rule?
Well, on those probates, we still have to operate off of a car contract. So we're still going to look at how that's checked. Just because the probate is being ran through in a certain way for the seller to sign, and that gives us the authority on who's signing on behalf of that seller or that estate, but we're still going to operate off of the car contract, and it's still going to be showing if that's checked or not checked. And
But if a judge orders it, it's so. Sometimes the court orders approves the commission.
Well, usually like the judge will order, you know, who's able on the letters of testimony or who's able to sign on behalf of the seller. That's usually what that probate is for, on who's going to be able to sell the property and sign on behalf of the property. But I think as far as when you guys are getting the contract signed, you're going to already know who's signing or who's petitioned the court for the probate. So then, you know, we still have to look at that page 2 on the 3G3 and see what, you know, if the courts are saying this only, then that's going to be a situation on if they're not going to allow compensation or concessions, then, but I don't think that would be the case. I think it would kind of be business as usual, just the probates breakdown on who's able to sell the property.
What documents are you required from us now as far as when we open escrow and we're on the buyer's side? What documents will you
We
be
have,
required?
if the 3G3 is checked, the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement and seller to pay buyer broker will provide that compensation amount to us. If it's not checked, then we're going to request, so if 3G3 is not checked, we'll request the BRBC confirmation page from the selling agent. Then we'll add that amount to the settlement statement. And then we also have some new forms that they're working on, which will be, so you'll see a couple new forms coming out. But escrow will be able to take the commission in writing only. So we'll either need the following for the file: the seller broker listing agreement, the second one buyer broker agreement, and then the third seller to pay buyer broker agreement if box 1, what is that, 1-8 or 1B?
No, that's 18.
18 is checked on the contract.
Is that for anything as of Monday? So everything that's already in escrow, we're going to leave it as is.
I believe as of Monday, that is going to go into effect for everybody. So I think on
What Mag is saying is if it's
already
Already in escrow, do we need
the same way you guys are having to go back and redo your forms.
a new one, I would think.
You guys are going to need new ones too?
I think just to state how it's going to be looked at, because don't you guys think on the on the settlements they have to show now, going from that date?
I would say possibly if you guys make any changes to your contract and your form and then resubmit to us, then we would have to make changes on our part.
So, Chris, right, we're not changing anything unless it's not pending. Everything that's already in contract, we're leaving as is, right? Or correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, so it depends on if it's using the old form or not, and the form's changed on July 24th, right? So if you're in, that's kind of the problem is like in some cases we had these listing agreements in the new format,
But still showing
compensation was still in the MLS, right?
right.
So you really have to examine the paperwork to determine, at least during this transition period, where you are with it.
So escrows that were open prior to today, prior to
Should be
August
fine.
13th,
Yeah.
could have the commission is only dealt with through the contractual offers in the MLS, and there is no BRBC, and the seller had already previously agreed to pay that
it.
commission through the
Yeah, but
MLS.
I would think that then we would just leave it as is.
I just have a suggestion. Something that we talked about practicing in the office was to make do a printout of the agent details that showed if you previously were in escrow. We talked about making that printing that out so you have it just for your file, just in case there's any hiccups.
Fortunately, now it's too late.
Oh yeah.
But we did do that. Yeah, she's right. We were recommending that, if you were, if there was something being offered in the MLS, print that sheet, because we knew it was going to disappear. So if you were in escrow, there would be no issues. But now that it's gone.
I was in the MLS committee meeting when, back several months ago when we were discussing the rule changes, and my understanding was the commission would stay with the pendings and the closeds. And so on the 13th, on Tuesday morning, I got up and turned my computer on and looked to see what it looked like, if it was there. And I didn't know if the new concession field was going to come at the same time. So I just kind of checked to see what kicked in. And then I started looking at pendings and closed. I'm wait a minute, there's no commission on any of this stuff. So it was a surprise to me, but I think it's probably, for what we discussed earlier with the appraiser, maybe a good thing that all that stuff is gone. And they just have to assume that there was commissions paid. I don't know.
Well, I was going to go back to the net sheets as well for you guys, and then the ones that you'll receive. Update as of next week, and we just received this today, so there will be a new seller credit to buyer field added. And then there's going to be a disclaimer that references the NAR agreement settlement on our net sheets. So
Just ask because there's really like three scenarios for compensation, right? There could be there could be the seller giving a credit to the buyer, right? There could be the seller giving a partial credit to the buyer and the buyer making up the difference. There could be the buyer paying the whole thing. So there's actually like three things. You guys are kind of accounting for that.
And that's why I say like it's going to be an escrow by escrow, case by case situation because we're going to start seeing those three scenarios. We're going to start seeing commission is at X, but seller's only going to contribute so much towards concessions. Buyer will make up the difference. So we'll show that on the settlement.
Yeah,
But we do have to, one thing that they're, that's gone into law now is buyers have to be aware. So if buyer's broker is getting the X number and buyer's paying a piece of it and seller's paying a piece of it, the buyer doesn't just see what they're paying. They have to know exactly what's being paid to their broker.
And also
amounts have to be disclosed.
Yeah. And also one thing you'll have to watch probably, I would imagine, in escrow is like the buyer can't pay more than what's on the BRBC.
Right.
So if that's a lower number than what was negotiated, technically the agent should have lowered it or had it. I've heard in the last couple of days that they are saying as long as the buyer agrees, the buyer and the buyer's agent can do an amendment to a modification of their buyer agreement to raise it. But that would mean you're going back to your buyer and saying, I'd like to make more money.
Right. We've learned that as well.
Yeah.
That there can be an amendment to that amount. So that amount wasn't, so if it was, X, and then they were like, oh, wait, we're missing out on a piece, you can do the amendment and give us the new amendment towards it. But like Chris said, how many times are you going to want to go back to your buyer just to say, I need an extra, so.
Real quick, you mentioned three different combinations of the way the commission or compensation could be paid. That there is a fourth. It's not illegal for a broker to offer cooperative compensation to a buyer's broker. Our forms don't cover that, and so you'd need to create your own modification or amendment or something, but it can be done. I've talked to one particular broker running around here saying that's what he's going to keep doing. So I'm not telling you. Well, so that's the way it looks today. So currently, up until the last few months, that's the normal way. We list a property for X and we offer 1/2 X, or some people are only offering less than that of X, but whatever they're offering, we offer that to a buyer's broker. And now that commission is actually, the way it really works is it's paid to listing broker, and listing broker splits it with buyer's broker. As of tomorrow, if we strictly are going by the language in our CAR forms, that option is gone. And now the buyer pays buyer's broker, seller pays seller's broker, and buyer through the contract, which used to be the big no-no, could say to seller, buyer says to seller in the contract, hey, I owe my broker this much. Will you pay it for me? That's effectively what 3G3 is. And then if that's adopted and the seller says yes, I tried it a few months ago because I wasn't happy with the amount that the seller's agent was offering through the co-op. And so I used 3G3 to say, hey, the broker's going to give me this much, but not me, but my buyer. They'd signed a BRBC and they said, broker's giving this. There was a worksheet where you showed up exactly. And it left this much that we wanted from the seller to give to the buyer. And the counter offer was no. So there you go.
If I could just add to what you were saying earlier, essentially cooperating compensation, it's not illegal. It's just that the California Association of Realtors decided to take an extremely conservative approach and get rid of any paperwork that would accommodate it, essentially, right? They got rid of the CBC form and all of that, and the MLS compensation and all of that. But what my understanding that one of the reasons for that is there's lots of pending litigation still going on. And the concern, I guess, is that it's going to go one way or the other. It's going to go in that direction. And um, from the legal standpoint, I think you just want to be careful. The problem is they can't speak on pending litigation, right? So we really don't know what the details are that are kind of driving some of these decisions, but I think we should be cautious. I'm going to take a conservative approach probably and go with what CAR advises, but I know there's other brokers that are doing other things. Yeah.
If we could change gears just a little bit, I know everything's a moving target these days with the escrow company. You're trying to catch up and learn and all that. I'd like to try to focus a little bit on the buyers. Now things are really focused on, okay, buyer, sign this and you're responsible for paying the buyer compensation. How are we going to help that buyer? Because how many of us have buyers, they come in and they can just about get the down payment maybe, or they're looking for down payment assistance, or they're asking the seller for help in closing costs. Now we're going to ask them to pay an additional dollar amount, whatever that may be. I'd like to see what people think, how we're going to help those buyers get through this. I just came back, just one other thing. I came back from upstate New York, and I have a nephew who's a broker in New York State. And he said they have been using the buyer rep form forever. He said it's not an issue. This is how we do business. He says this is how I've always done business. I think we're going to get there. We just have to figure out a way to get there right. Suggestions?
I think it's something that we've always needed. We all been at the point where we've shown property before and not gotten paid. So I think this is something that we've always needed. And I think really it's explaining your worth to the buyer and your job so they know that there is a job that's being done. And doing it and having sat down and doing buyer's consultations really changes the game, I feel like, for the buyers. And when we're sitting down doing those buyer's consultations, I really feel like that's when the buyer really gets to feel our worth and why we need the buyer broker compensation.
What to do when we get the phone call on one of our listings and you've never met the buyer and they say, hey, can you meet me at the house in an hour? I'd really love to show that to my family. How are you going to handle it?
I'll speak to that. I'm going to ask them to come in and do a buyer's consultation first and bring them into the office, sit them down and go over the changes and explain to them and answer any questions they have before meeting at the house. I don't know if anybody has anything different. That's my game plan.
Ideal situation for sure, but we're all going to have that buyer that we want to grab, we want to capture, and we want to help them, but they don't have time to come in. Or maybe you say you have to. I don't know. I'm just throwing out ideas to get the conversation started.
For your safety, I hope you're not doing that now.
Not really, no.
Okay. So this leads to a conversation I had yesterday with a few agents talking about, so in the new listing agreement, when we're talking about how much we're going to get paid, the next paragraph talks about unrepresented buyers and are we going to charge extra for those? So just discussing unrepresented buyers, real quick. I mean, that was an interesting conversation I was having with these other guys because I just said, well, I'm just inclined to say, hey, sign this form and I'm your agent, or go find some other agent. I'm not going to deal with an unrepresented buyer. I was pointed out that I may be mistaken in that scenario because I have an obligation to my seller. This is a potential buyer that maybe wants to buy it and save the money and be unrepresented. And now, am I going to pass on that buyer because he won't do what I want him to do? Just a thought.
I don't think it's necessarily that you're wanting to pass that buyer, but I think if we explain to the seller the precautions that we have to take when there's an unrepresented buyer, there's so much liability behind it. So I think it just falls back on the seller whether they want us to work with somebody that's being unrepresented or not.
I think it goes back to what you said about demonstrating your value. And I'm just curious about the agents in this room, if any of you have put together a menu or a buyer flyer, how, especially the low income, we're in Tulare County, we have a lot of FHA, we have a lot of down payment assistance, we have a lot of asking for seller closing costs. What does that menu look like that you're offering? Are you offering tiered services? If you are the listing agent and you're now going to have to represent it was an unrepresented buyer, but now you're going to step in and handle that. Is there a menu of tiered services that as agents you are prepared to offer and also explain your value to these clients.
I've actually started making my own. I already had a buyer's package ready for my buyer consultations. However, I'm revamping it at this point to include those same things, and have been researching the tiered services because I think that might end up being the best option.
On Brittany down there, because I think she would be one that would have lots of material for buyers. Brittany? Turn.
do, but I don't know that it's where I sell most of my real estate is in Minnesota, and we also have always had buyer rep agreements. The verbiage basically hasn't changed for us. It still outlines the same commissions and everything. So we use a system called High Notes, and I use that here and there for a buyer representation that includes, all the things we do. I've never had a tiered process though. I think it could be handy, but it definitely provides, ultimately you have to decide what your value is and how much of your energy you can pour into the career, and if it still suits you, right? Like when you start talking tiers and like lowering your value, you're not only lowering your value or what you provide, you're lowering the standard in the industry.
Yep.
That actually makes me quite nervous.
I agree with what you just said, and I want to turn it back to Heather and say, are you seeing that other places? Have you heard people talking about it? What drove you to ask that question?
Well, Miss Switzerland here, who hears and sees everything in all the office meetings. Yes, I think people are trying to get creative. As Kathy said, this isn't about the sellers and taking listings, and there's definitely a consensus that it's business as usual and nothing will change. If we stick to that mindset and that mentality, then what's going on with the DOJ and NAR is irrelevant. And it honestly is not irrelevant, and it is wanting and forcing a lot of change within this industry. And there's been a lot of focus about sellers and convincing them to continue to pay X% concessions. I appreciate you bringing up the buyers, because I think that that's not a conversation. What is going to prevent a buyer from just showing up and say, I can't afford an agent. I only have $2,500 towards my down payment, and that's scraping every penny. Will you do this for, I'm going to just throw out a nominal fee of $500, or, again, that brings down the value of what you're doing as a buyer's agent in a traditional market. However, it's now created this storm where, do you leave that person unrepresented, or do you help them enough? Because you're representing the seller, you want to close the deal. So I think people are getting creative. I think the buyer conversation, we're going to see a lot of that in the next few weeks as this rolls out. But there's been a lot of focus on the sellers, the listings, how to do those presentations, what to tell your sellers, that across the board in every office meeting I go to, definitely. But there's creative talk about how do we help these buyers of Tulare County that can't afford 3% out of pocket, and sellers not willing to. Sorry for the talk about numbers.
Yeah, we can't talk numbers, please.
But in the traditional market that we were in, there was a expectation of a buyer to pay a certain amount that was typically covered by a seller in a transaction, right? So now the seller is not going to make concessions that way, or in this particular instance, not make any. How do the buyers then go into this deal?
So first of all, there was no expectation of any certain numbers previously, and it wasn't the buyer's responsibility typically as a rule previously. And now our practice says buyer pays, seller pays. Will the seller pay the buyer's obligation? And I think in my conversations with sellers, it's, you don't have to pay that now. You didn't before either, but the news told you don't have to, and I understand that. Here's why I think you should consider it, and let's wait and see what happens when the buyer makes offers and those kinds of things. So I don't think, I'm not putting my head in the sand by saying that I believe we'll continue to see sellers assist buyers. Now they're assisting the buyers in their obligation to pay compensation.
Sorry to interrupt. I think we're going to take a little break now. Let's keep this going in a few more minutes. Thank you so much.
So before our break, we were talking with Heather about a myriad of issues. One of them was, what does a buyer do or a buyer's broker do when the buyer doesn't have the money? Is that taking them out of the market, or what can we do about that, Chris?
So it's definitely a challenge. The new buyer rep agreement does have a spot where you can indicate if the buyer doesn't have the funds to compensate their agent, and you check a box and it makes it a contingency of the agreement. So they're not tied to it unless they can get it covered by the seller. It's basically the answer. Now, when it comes to, them asking you, to show a property that maybe the agent has said there is no concessions being given, you're still really obligated to show them that property, write up the offer anyway. And, this concession thing is they may or may not accept concessions, present them with the offer, hope for the best. And if it doesn't work out, hopefully there'll be another property that they can buy.
Keep in mind, everything is negotiable. You can be creative, whether it's purchase price, whether it's compensations, everything is negotiable with enough effort and enough talk maybe to the buyer and the seller's agent and all that kind of stuff. Try it. Everything's been negotiable in the past, and that doesn't change. Work it out.
Follow-up question. So the buyer, I know the answer, but I'd like to open this up publicly, is can they make payments to their agent over time with this deal? Does it have to be paid? If a buyer chooses to pay their agent, they don't have all of the money up front, can they make payments to their agent over a set period of time according to a contract as they do in commercial real estate?
That would be the broker's decision to offer those types of settlements, those types of arrangements. I don't think we can set any kind of a general, but it would be by each broker and owner what they decide to do.
And as far as settlement would go, like where we're showing it on the settlement statement, we have to know what we're collecting from the buyer at the time we close. So we're not bill collectors. So anything negotiated like that would have to be, we'd have to know what we were doing through the escrow. And then if you chose or your broker chose to do something different outside of escrow, then that would have to be a separate agreement.
Like a promissory note or something. I don't know.
Which escrow would not be drawing up.
I've actually been involved in those types of transactions from buyers and sellers. And in the case where the seller was going to pay us later with my broker's agreement and arrangement, we got paid right away, earlier than we planned. In the case where the buyer was going to pay me, I'm still waiting, and it was years and years and years ago. Actually, a couple of those lately.
Add on to the what we were talking about before, the buyers without money. I think as agents, you'll want to decide if you want to work with somebody that doesn't have the funds to compensate you, under the condition that you might get it covered by the seller. And that's going to be a personal business decision, I think. For the buyers that are nervous about signing an agreement where they're committing to that when they don't have the money, that contingency is in place that protects them. And this is how I'd explain it to them. There's a contingency in the contract that protects you, the buyer rep agreement, that says, essentially, we understand you don't have any money. And if you don't have the money and we're not able to swing a deal where it's coming from the seller, I'm not going to hold you to it. So there is a protection for buyers that don't have money in the BRBC.
So then are you working for free in that scenario?
That's going to have to be an agent or broker's personal opinion, preference. Likely what's going to happen is when you're having this is my opinion, okay? I'm open to differing opinions. So my opinion would be when you sit down with the buyer in the beginning and you explain the process, you're going to approach the possibility that because they don't have money, you may run into a seller that's not willing to compensate me as your agent. And at that time, we're probably going to need to make the decision whether this is the right house for you, whether you can afford to buy it. And possibly not. and then we'll hopefully find you one that you can.
So, and in attorney terms, it could be pro bono, right? Like people are going to look for people that are going to represent them and not to have to pay them initially out of their closing funds.
Well, no, the agreement has to have something on it, right? So whatever that X or Y amount is, the buyer is agreeing to pay it. However, there's a contingency that says when they don't have money, there's a contingency in place that allows them to not to get out of the BRBC. Basically.
There's actually a worksheet for that contingency, so they can demonstrate that they don't have the money.
Yeah, just doesn't tie them to paying the agent because they found them a house but couldn't get the compensation. Right? It protects the buyer, is what it does. Yeah.
I think we all need to remember too, since this is public, to the buyers that we're here to work with you, we're here to work for you, and that's why we're doing this roundtable presentation as we're talking about it, because I think everybody in the industry is feeling the same way, but we are here for the buyers, and we are here to educate them and talk these things through, and this is the whole reason why we brought this.
Last thing, sorry, I don't mean to hog the mic on this, but like my personal opinion is if somebody wants to buy a home, and they have all the other resources to do it. They can get the loan. They have everything else other than they can't pay me. I'm still going to represent them, and I'm going to try my best to find them a house where my compensation can be covered. That's the way I'm going to approach it.
We forget that we used to do this with when they needed closing costs. When they needed closing costs, how many times they found the perfect house and the seller would not budge on the closing costs? What did they do? They moved on to the next house. And I mean, it's just a different way of doing business. But like Melissa said, we're here to serve our buyers. And one other thing that I want to point out, everything we hear on social media is determined to the seller. We already know a lot of information that you don't have to pay commission, but no one's talking about buyers and buyers' agents. Besides, buyer agents are gone. That's not true. There's so many resources, and now with the lending being able for us to add concessions on top of the other concessions, that's a game changer for all of us. But there's not enough information being thrown on social media, on the news, on the letters. Everything is about sellers, how you're going to be reducing your compensation, but no one's talking about buyers and how they're still able to buy a house with all these amazing programs. So I think we just need to take it back, a step back, and say, okay, remember, at one point there used to be credit for closing costs. There wasn't, and we pivot. So we're just going to have to pivot, get creative, and do things a little bit different.
I agree 100%. And it's going to start right at the beginning when you're first meeting the buyer. Open house. How do we handle the open house? I know there's a form that we can fill out. We can have them fill out. But some people, when you do an open house, they have the buyer sign in. Some people don't. What are we going to do from this point forward?
I just want to add to that. So an open house, I know that if you're doing your own open house, you representing the seller, it's okay to allow them in because you're representing your seller and you're doing your fiduciary for your seller. However, if you're doing an open house for somebody else, then it's going to change how you do that.
If you're talking to a buyer about the house, okay, X amount of bedrooms, this is the purchase price, and that type of thing. At some point, you're going to be starting to represent that buyer. And once you cross that line, we've got to have some kind of an agreement based on the rules and the way things are changing.
I agree.
Where is that line, and what do we do?
Line is anything other than what's on your flyer. You have a flyer, it's got the bedrooms, baths, it's got the square footage. Once you start talking motivation or anything negotiating, anything outside of, in my opinion, what you can present to a buyer on behalf of your seller, your fiduciary to your seller, that's the line. It's difficult though, right? If they come in and they don't want to sign that open house form, there's a new form, right? Which says they're not represented and everything you say to them is for the benefit of the seller. They don't want to sign that. Let them through the house, let them walk through. You just, here's the flyer, have at it. And, once the conversation opens back up to motivation or any of that kind of stuff, then you have to just stop them and say, I don't represent you. And before I can answer any questions, we have to enter an agreement where I do.
Historically, when I do open houses, I have the flyer on the house that has all that information. I also have a features list, especially the high-end homes. All the features, what's been remodeled, what's been done. And I also provide a comp
list of comps in the neighborhood. Is any of that crossing the line that I have to have them sign, or is that just okay to give and say, okay, that's it?
All selling points though, right? Why are you, if you're providing comps for the benefit of your seller, then it's a selling point in my opinion.
We're also trying to give them information about what else is available in the neighborhood. Yep, I want to sell this house, but if they're walking out the door and they're looking at a different house down the street, I want to maybe try to help them and represent that if they've given up on my listing.
Yeah, I think that's the point where you have to have an agreement.
And I think what you're sharing.
Said you wanted to represent them, so either sign this and let me represent you today, or sign this and tell me you're unrepresented, or our conversation is over.
Yeah, and Kathy, I think what you were sharing is public data, but not to scare away all of the buyers that are going to be attending open houses this weekend. I think it gets a little bit scary because we're talking about every buyer. When you walk in the door, you need to sign this form right now. Whoa, what does that mean? You're going to be my agent forever. I just met you. I don't know if I like you. Or I just want to look through the house. If I don't sign your form, can you not talk to me about the house? And I think I'm not a real estate agent. However, I have heard that there is a form that can be signed that just for this open house. So you, as an open house agent, you're printing these out. You're having those people versus the way you're trying to recruit.
And actually, Chris had mentioned that earlier, that he does have a form and it covers about 3 houses.
Three
Is that
houses,
right?
30 days.
Okay,
Yeah.
so there's another part of this as well, is that people aren't going, like the builders aren't going to stop people from coming in and seeing the model homes, right? And actually, when you think about the way the new concessions are going to work, it's a lot like a builder, right? Because they're representing, and there's a big percentage of people that are represented by the builder in that sense, right? So then they're going to give them, credits or do whatever to help them out as buyers, because this is a huge conversation going around buyers and how we can help them out. So the thing is, we don't want to stop people from going through open houses, like, as Heather's saying. And there are a lot of people that are going to come in that are unrepresented, or they will have an agreement. So what Chris had mentioned before, and I kind of like the way he said it, is that if you have the conversation with them and you ask them, are you represented? And they say, yes, I am. Then he is like, come on in. And
Have you signed an agreement with your agent? Okay, come on in.
correct. Not just are you represented, but also going into the buyer broker representation.
So there's 2 agreements. There is the PSRA and the BRBC. This is what we call the dating, and then this is what we call committed. That's just kind of our language for it. And that's what we've created. So this one just says, hey, we're dating. I'm going to show you 3 in 30 days. This form exists. Then this is our long-term relationship. So for buyers to know that, we're talking about both forms. So maybe you're not sure of me, and maybe, want to get to know each other and see how I work, how they work, and we work together, right? We'd want to use this form. And then if we want to go long-term, we're using the BRBC.
And it's dating non-exclusive.
Correct. I like that because you're trying to, you're showing your value. You got to give them value and show them your worth, so that gives them time to kind of make the connection and then to marry you. And essentially, right?
Real quick, for the people, for the intents and purpose of the video and the people that are going to be watching the video, maybe first-time buyers, does somebody want to take the time and actually explain what a concession is and how that looks from a seller to a buyer? Because we've thrown the word out a lot and in a lot of different, meanings. And so maybe somebody wants to take the time to actually, make sure what a concession is.
I did want to, I was been trying to interject here for a while, so. So there is a 1-page form for the open houses. You don't have to have that or that. There's just a 1-page form. Is that clear? Is that right?
There is a one form that you can use at open houses, and I think it's all of our approach and how we go about our open houses, right? I mean, we go in and we're like, hey, nice to meet you. I am Michaela. I am hosting this open house. Are you currently working with somebody? You let someone walk in. You don't just bombard them with here, sign this. My approach has kind of been, and opinion-wise, and please do get forward if there's something I should correct, but I always try to get someone to sign in, right? That's our job as realtors. We want
to make sure we are accounting for who's coming in. So I kind of use that approach, like, you know, seller wants to account for who's coming in, and I'd love to know, are you working with somebody? Yes. Okay, well, please do put their name down and your name, and I'd love to give them more information about this home if something does change, right? Our approach is everything, and not saying, you know, you're coming to me, I need you to sign, but it's about how we bring it towards them in that moment. So I just feel like
That's the way most of us do. I know there's a few agents that don't get names; they just let them wander in. But that's typically how I approach it as well. I've got everything sitting up right in the entryway, and as you greet them, have them sign in and give them a goodie bag or something.
I think we should address Courtney's question real quick. Just in general, simple terms, a concession would be any time that a buyer is asking a seller to pay something that would normally be paid by the buyer. So we have escrow fees and title fees and lots of things that are divvied up in a customary fashion. And if the buyer, especially new first-time home buyers, people like that, that are just scrimping to be able to buy a house, don't have money for that, it's customary and traditionally, in that market, we expect buyers to ask for some monetary amount or percent to cover those things that the buyer would normally cost. Now, in addition to that, we're lumping buyer compensation into the potential concession as well.
Another word that can be used for a concession can be a credit. So it can just be a credit of some sort from the seller.
From the lending standpoint of it, so when we look for concessions for the buyer, that is going to be specifically for your one-time fees, your upfront taxes, insurance, and so forth. When you say concessions that the buyer has to pay, you know, as regards to, you know, here for the realtors, I wouldn't even use the word concession in our world, because when we look for concessions, we're looking what the seller is going to be paying for closing costs and prepaids. So that would be something above, because even our lending terms hasn't caught up with this. And when we have our conversations too, we're just going to wait and see how this all trickles down, because nothing has really changed for us. From our end.
So will you guys get an update for you guys? Because that's the word that has been said to us as concessions.
Yeah. So two things. So you guys need it to be broken down and show that this is for compensation. Yes. This is for traditional concessions. Right. And that's where Allison will come in and all of that. I keep using it, and maybe I'm overusing it, but I call it a 3G3 concession, because that's where it's addressed. So in our world, so you explained your world, in our world, we can't say compensation in the MLS, and the only way we can address that whether the seller is willing to help with that or not is by calling it a concession.
And not commission either, so that's the other word for
we
that.
can't use anything. So in case somebody's watching that doesn't know, our MLS rules, in order to be in compliance with the settlement, we cannot ever have any mention of anything that has to do with broker compensation, period. And so we have to be very careful with that. Our MLS rules have changed. And if you're not familiar with that, you better get familiar, because if you put a new MLS listing in there and you tell us what your seller is willing to do exactly, and you call it compensation, you're going to owe a $2,000 fine. So familiarize yourself with the new rules.
The first violation, right?
Yeah.
For our members out there, reiterate that the fines. Is there a warning? Is there a grace period? Does this start on Monday, and how much is it?
It is a tier 4 fine, which is our maximum fines. First offense will cost you $2,000. Second offense will be $4,000. The third offense will be $6,000, and you could be kicked out of the MLS as well. So, and the reason why it's so serious, and the same goes for putting together a transaction without a BRBC, and that's got the same fine levels. And the reason is that if we're caught not being in compliance with the settlement, we could be kicked out of the settlement and exposed to the verdicts that are out there or that might be coming down the road. So we have to be serious about it.
contracts, I think it's really important that when we're talking with a buyer and a seller, that we are talking how the three contracts marry each other. It's super important to go over the three contracts at all times because they do all marry each other, which is the BRBC, the residential listing agreement, and the RPA.
Go ahead. To clarify, when do we go live starting the BRC? Is it tomorrow? Well, or today?
Tomorrow.
Okay. So everything that we wrote back when we asked for that 3G, do we have to have a copy also of the buyer agreement or no? Yes, we do. Okay.
Check 3G3 on the contract, you're saying you had a BRBC. Yeah. You're basically the addendum it attaches, which is the I'm getting my acronyms mixed up. PRBB or whatever it is. The SPBB that attaches to the RPA.
Some of us have no idea what that is. It's just
the verbiage in there says, the verbiage in there says you have a BRBC. And also you can be asked to provide the last page of that BRBC, which shows how much you're getting compensated.
For Diana and I, we'd like to know what BRBC stands for.
Buyer representation, what is it? You got my book.
Buyer
Represent. I don't know.
Buyer representation and broker compensation agreement.
Yeah.
Don't say that 10 times fast.
When we're looking at the purchase agreement, there is seller credit is how they word the credit to this to the buyer is a credit, and if the seller is paying to the buyer's broker, it's buyer to compensate buyer's broker. So it's compensation and seller credit.
I like what Melissa said about the three contracts merit. Was it Melissa or Michaela? Melissa said about, I can't even tell you guys apart. So they got matching shirts on. I like what she said about the three contracts. I'm assuming that comes through your brokerage and that's something they preach to you. But another simple way to think of that is, BRBC, that's my contract with my buyer. I keep saying it's a listing agreement with the buyer. So I've got my contract with my buyer, I've got my listing agreement with my seller, and then I have RPA that marries the buyer and seller together. It's real simple. I love that, and we should all be thinking in those terms. Now, just like the the RPA has a million other forms that you, depending on what boxes you check when you're done, you might have 10 forms attached to it. Just like that, the BRBC now has 3 or 4 forms that automatically, every time I use a BRBC, it's going to populate 3 or 4 more forms as well. I don't know the exact number, but to reach the settlement solutions that we had to reach, CAR came out with over 20 new forms just specifically dealing with this. So it's nice to think of it like there's 3 contracts, but each contract has a million things to go with it.
Right, Chris?
Or sometime there was a slight change.
There were some soft changes to the listing agreement. I mean, nothing huge, but they did make some. If you printed one today, there's a couple of things that are slightly different. Nothing incredibly concerning. So they're just cleaning up some verbiage, I think.
Follow-up question in regards to these open houses, because not everybody coming through is looking, or they're not looking for themselves. They may be looking or neighbors, or they're looking for their family members and they want to come through the house. The first set of eyes for them, right? How does that work?
We just did that. So we had a lady come in with her best friend, right? She's like, well, I'm not looking. And I was like, well, why don't you just put your name right underneath so-and-so's? Because, I mean, they do have to sign in and we're not, but why don't you just put your name in there? I mean, that's the approach that I did so far just with them. And if that's something that we shouldn't have done, then that was just... So always for our sellers, right? I feel like it makes them feel comfortable knowing who came in, and you could backtrack on who's entering your home.
And for the open house, if you're sitting at the open house, then you're representing the seller. So it's.
So I had
this person had an agent just to add to that. So I just said put it.
I had a meeting this morning at 6:00 with a group of people that I meet with. We're close and we meet once a month, and they were asking me about this stuff and we were talking about it, and I sold a house to one of the guys and his wife just a few months ago, and they said, well, while our house was in escrow, we went around to open houses to see what the floors look like and trying to get ideas on how to change this or that. It was a house in the Del Lago neighborhood where there's lots of houses like theirs. And so they were just going around to open houses to get decorating and renovation tips. And I said, you know what? I said, I think going forward, if you just came to the door and told me that's all you were doing, you're not shopping for a house, and I'll say, come on in. I can't really answer any questions about the house, but here's a flyer.
About open houses, that has come up a couple of times. The question of holding an open house for another agent at another company. And you got to be, what I've been told is it's not a recommended practice. You're obviously not representing the seller when you're doing that. So it's going to be complicated if you do. And theoretically, you could not, you potentially are not covered by E&O by doing that. So you want to be really cautious about holding open houses for another brokerage. Same brokerage, perfectly fine. Other brokerages, it's a risky maneuver.
Good point.
Yeah.
Follow up on Chris's, that's exactly what the attorney we listened to this morning said, was no open houses for another company, and your E&O is voided.
Something. So back to the buyer representations, you talked about not, we're dating and we're committed. Also, just want to say that the buyer, I had this conversation earlier with the buyer, and they said, okay, so what if I don't want to sign a contract that I'm committed to you? And I explained to her, wow, this could just be for this one time. We can, build a relationship. And if at that time you decide, no, this is not going to work for us, then okay, there, it ends. But if not, then we can extend our commitment, our contract with 30 days, 60 days, or whatever it is. And also explain that it doesn't have to be everywhere. It could just be Tulare County. It could just be, in Visalia or Tulare or whatever. So there's a lot of different ways as well for the buyer agreement.
Maybe one more minute. I want to thank everybody who attended. I think this will be the first of many of these. We need to get the word out. We need to educate our community, our buyers and our sellers, and our coworkers. So are there any other comments that you want to make? Thank you so very much. Great day. Have a good one. Go sell houses. Thanks. Bye.